from the News Channel 5 network, this is OpenLine.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to OpenLine. Glad you are with us tonight. Tonight, we're talking about labor unions. And of course, as the country is looking at a possible railroad strike, we can get into some of the issues surrounding that, some of the details surrounding that. And then just here in Tennessee, how impactful are labor unions? Certainly, other states, they're more impactful than they are in Tennessee. What about what are some of the plans for labor unions here in our state? Happy to have with us somebody who can help us with all of this. And certainly you can call in with your questions. We have with us Jason Freeman with SEIU. Thank you, Jason, for being here.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
You were just on not that long ago talking about Amendment 1. That did not pass. We can talk about that later. But let's talk labor unions in general and the railroad strike. I know you have nothing to do with a railroad union. That's not what SEIU is. Yep. But you're kind of following this. And what is it you're following? What kind of stands out to you in this whole railroad thing?
Well, I think what stands out to me is what seems to be the biggest issue is sick days. A lot of people in your employee, we just went through a global pandemic, right? And what my understanding is that in the current agreement, you know, the union representatives, the workers, I always tell people there's no such thing as a union that is not union members. So when you say union, you're really talking about a bunch of people who work somewhere, who join together to have a voice in their workplace. They wanted 15 paid sick days. They currently have 0. And the agreement, I think, had 1 personal day. And so, you know, I heard one of the presidents of one of the rail unions on the radio today saying he thought that the members would have ratified it with 4 sick days. You know, most people would think about in your job if you had no paid sick days. You know, I have a 2-year-old. That'd be a problem for me if I didn't have any sick time, if I didn't have any family leave time. It presents a lot of problems. And I think one of the things that the rail union representatives are raising to is safety standards, right? A train is nothing to play around with. It can be a very dangerous place to be. And if you're sick, you're not going to be on your best game. And that puts not just your own life in danger, potentially other people's lives in danger.
So if there is a strike, it would be devastating to the economy. And it looks like Congress is going to intervene and stop this strike. Is that right? And how does that work as far as you know?
So I am not an expert on, you know, the Railway Act or, you know, what Congress's authority is here. I do know that Congress can take an action to, I don't believe that they can prevent a strike necessarily, but I believe that they can take an action to force the agreement to be accepted. So in other words, to say, you know, just because some of the unions rejected the agreement, that this is going to be the agreement that moves forward and is the contract. But I think past that, I mean, on some level, you know, I don't know the ins and outs of the legalities, but if people want to walk off the job, they can walk off the job. Now, there may be consequences for them if they do that, but you know, at the end of the day, I think these are people looking out for themselves and their families, and it's not that anyone wants to harm the economy. I think the question we should be asking is, you know, companies are making record profits. We know the rail industry is making record profits, and, you know, I'm certain that these companies can afford to provide some sick days. So, you know, who's really to blame if there's a stoppage?
It's interesting. Congress can step in and say, you have to accept this. You know, you have to accept this. Yes, you're right. They could walk off the job, but then it's been, you know, mandated that it be ratified, yep, essentially. So your gut, do you think there will be people walking off the job, or what do you think? Are you just watching this?
I'm just watching it and listening, and I certainly can't speak for any of those workers or those unions. And you know, I'm sure that they'll make the best decision for themselves and their family. And you know, I think again, it shouldn't come to this, but unfortunately, we see this time and again that companies are driven by one thing, and that is profits. And they generally are making all their decisions based on maximizing those profits, not, you know, doing the best thing. And you would think now, if the economy is really at stake, and what would be the holdup is 4 sick days, it seems like they could provide the 4 sick days.
So how much power do you think unions have now? Let's kind of talk about the state of unions.
Okay.
And it might go different depending on what state literally you're in. I used to live in Illinois. Unions are much more powerful than they are in Tennessee. But nationwide right now, Do you think unions are ascending or maintaining or declining?
I think they're 100% ascending, and I will say Tennessee, I think 2 years ago, was the fastest growing union membership in the country, had the fastest rate of new union members in the country. I think what we've seen in recent elections and what we've seen in labor actions around the country, from workers at Starbucks that are organizing, workers at Amazon in New York that are organizing, and people just in general, coffee shops. We saw a coffee shop locally here. Multiple of the Starbucks were in Tennessee. We're seeing that people understand. I think the pandemic really opened people's eyes to this, that they're worth more than they're being paid. And people are not going to just go work a job that doesn't provide any fulfillment for their life for pennies. And they know that companies are making huge profits all the time. And it's very clear to people that we're not being paid what we're worth. And so I think that just that consciousness, the desire, we've seen polling that unions are polling at the highest approval ratings they've had in a very long time and rising. I think what we need to have happen is we need the federal labor laws to catch up to that and to really give people a level playing field. Really all a union is bringing some democracy into the workplace. We talk about the United States as the greatest country in the world basically because of our fundamental rights and democracy, that we have agency to choose our government, to choose what kind of society we have, and that's all a union is. It's giving workers the ability to have a say in the conditions, and workers are entitled to that right because workers are the ones that generate the profits.
So unions were higher. The heyday for unions was when?
The heyday was, following the Great Depression into World War II. I think the following World War II, I think really the highest union density happened in that time period, like into the 50s, 60s, and started to decline after that.
Why do you think there was the decline? Well, I mean, some of it they talked about corruption, or they talked about, they were raising prices, all of these criticisms you hear. Why do you think it declined, and, how do you how do you deal with some of that?
So there was a few things. One thing is the Taft-Hartley Act that was passed a long time ago. Really weakened labor unions. That was right after the war. Truman, I believe, signed the Taft-Hartley Act, and that dramatically weakened the labor laws in this country. So that was one step. So we had a legal framework that gave people more rights to organize and greater protections on the job. That changed. The second thing is technology. So with all the automation and machinery and just massive technological innovation, that gave companies greater leverage over manufacturing. So whereas you used to be able to, if you could shut down one plant in Flint, Michigan, you could shut down all of Ford Motor Company. Well, you can't do that anymore. And companies changed the way that their assembly lines worked and their manufacturing structure. And so they adapted, as companies do, because companies are not like people who need to eat and sleep or whatever. They're just trying to make money, and they're going to just continue to change and try to capture more money. And the last thing I think is globalization. I mean, the opening up of trade markets across the world, and that really, created the opportunity for outsourcing, which makes it difficult when you outsource a plant that was, in Michigan or in, Missouri or something, and now it's in China. That is certainly a difficult thing to do. Or
that was NAFTA, right?
NAFTA, and even before that.
And well, some of the argument there is, okay, here in the United States or here in, in Michigan, there was a union that was mandating people get paid a living wage, $20 an hour. They can go down to Mexico, and there's nothing like that. They can pay workers a lot less. They can produce the same cars. And so why not do that? And so then unions kind of took some of the blame, it seemed like, for companies moving to other parts of the world. And then it became, we can't have these unions that are making us pay these high wages when the rest of the world can do things more cheaply.
Sure. Well, we could do a whole show on trade policy, but there is like one thing that's, I forget the name, the rule of origin is something in a trade agreement. And in NAFTA, one of the problems was, so all the countries that are in the free trade agreement, if you're in, you only have to build, say, 40% of the car in the country that's in the trade agreement, and you could build 60% of all the parts for the car in countries over here that are outside the trade agreement. And so you might have had labor standards in the trade agreement that says you have to have a certain level of wages, a certain level of safety conditions, and whatever environmental protections. But the 5 countries over here that are making 60% of the vehicle don't have to have those things. So that dramatically lowers the cost of production and makes it the incentive to move that company. And so that was one of the things in the U.S., what was it, MTA or something, the new updated version of NAFTA. That was one of the major things that when I worked here, opposing the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and a big part of it was those rules. Another part of it was something called investor-state dispute resolution, which basically sets up like a private arbitration process where companies can sue countries for violating the agreement and lost profits and recoup millions of dollars if you change your environmental regulations past the agreement. And so there's a lot of things in there that cause that, but I really do think things like automation had a much bigger impact, and that just what it causes companies to do is to just say, thank you for working here for 15 years, but now I have a machine that can do what you do, and now I don't care anymore. And I think something changed in our culture where when we had a larger density of unions, we had less income inequality, and we had a smaller disparity between the CEO and the assembly person on the floor. And to some extent, they went to the same church, right? They shopped at the same grocery store. They saw each other. Well, now we have this whole upper class of people, this 1%, that they're living in a place that we don't live in, right? They are not interacting with us. They don't go to the grocery store, right? And if they do, it's not the store that you go to. And they're somewhat isolated from the ramifications, the societal implications of.
Is that because unions have died? I think that's very interesting. Do you think that's because unions haven't maintained, not died, but haven't maintained their influence?
I think partly, and I think I think that the deck has been stacked against us in a lot of ways. You had things like Ronald Reagan breaking the air traffic controller strike was a very famous turning point, where you used to have people like, if you go back, President Eisenhower, who is a Republican, was still a labor-friendly president for the he's, I don't know all of the details of his presidency, but he still said things that recognized the contributions of unions. He didn't demonize them the way that we have. Mike Pompeo, who is former Secretary of State, who is going to run for president, he literally just said the most dangerous person in the world is the president of a teachers union in the United States. A group of teachers who are advocating for better pay and benefits for themselves. The leader of them, this man just called the most dangerous person in the world, more dangerous than Vladimir Putin. It's absurd, but it does, I think, give you a little bit of insight to where we used to have two parties that somewhat had a, if not respect, a healthy understanding that working people were going to have a say in this country because they were organized and they were exercising their voices. And I think part of what we're seeing with language like that is a backlash. What I think Amendment 1 was also about, putting right to work in our Constitution, is they see people organizing, they see people having a voice, and they are fighting back very aggressively because ultimately people like Mike Pompeo just are doing the bidding of big corporations and representing their bottom lines.
Can we get back? It's very interesting you say they used to go to the same church. The guy, the head of the company, and the workers, they used to go to the same church, same supermarket. Maybe that doesn't happen now. Can we get back to that? Can unions bring us back to that, or is that long since passed?
Well, I certainly believe we can, and there's a path to do it. I do think we need federal labor laws to change. I think that it's essential that we pass something like the PRO Act, which will give workers more protection. Right now, Tennessee is an at-will state. So in most workplaces, if you don't have a union, you can get fired for no reason, for any reason. And there's no recourse for you. There's virtually no protection. And I think, that's, people ask, what is the benefit of having a union? That's, to me, is the top of the list. If you have a union contract, you are no longer an at-will employee. There has to be some just cause. There's typically a process, disciplinary, written, documented. There are steps that the employer has to take to show that you can be fired for a just cause. And I think, can we get back to the place where, can we lower income inequality to where there's, not these billionaires that are, buying social media companies for fun? I don't know, but I think we can certainly close the gap, and we can certainly give working people a greater say in how this country functions. We have to go to break, but then I want to ask, well, I'm going to ask right now before we go to break. I mean, this notion of fired, for just cause, that is one of the things that gets brought up sometimes, that sometimes because you have to go through so many hoops to remove an employee, that bad employees are kept working. Yeah. And so what do you say to that? If people say, wow, the union, they keep, bad employees on, people who aren't working as hard, that kind of thing, that criticism, what do you say? So I think this is a trope that I think, companies have used forever. I mean, there was a famous case, they did this with tort reform, right, with liability lawsuits. And there was this famous example that they would cite of a woman who spilled hot coffee from McDonald's on her legs and then sued McDonald's. And that was an example of someone who never should have had the ability to sue. That was a frivolous lawsuit. And it turns out that woman had third-degree burns on both of her legs because McDonald's heated their coffee over a temperature that was dangerous because it saved them money in some regard. They got less coffee returned for being cold or something, right? And so I think this is a similar thing where it's very easy to point at like one anecdote. People really respond to stories and anecdotes, and I'm sure you can find a place where one person is exploiting the rules and like maybe should get fired but isn't. What's more happening is like what's happening at Starbucks, where Howard Schultz is indiscriminately firing, well, whoever's in charge of Starbucks is indiscriminately firing anybody who wants to organize a union, and there's virtually no repercussions. And I think that is far more common. I think most people, if you ask them, have been in a situation where they got fired for a job for no reason whatsoever. Then why can't that story take hold? I mean, maybe you're right. I remember the McDonald's thing, and I did hear the other side. But you're right. The ship had sailed on what people thought, and they thought it was a frivolous lawsuit and all of that. And so, it's a compelling story. Yeah, that's the story they tell. That it's keeping people employed that shouldn't be employed. But if the other side is it's protecting people, that would mean people are being fired who shouldn't be fired. It seems like that story would get more play. Well, I think, the reality is just people's economic conditions. I mean, if you get fired from a job, it takes a certain type of person to say, like, am I going to go seek out a reporter like you and ask you to tell the story? And as an individual, if you're thinking to yourself, am I going to get my job back? Am I going to want to get my job back there, even if I cause a big stink about it? And then they have to think to themselves, I've got to go get a job somewhere else. Who's going to hire me if I'm on the news complaining about my employer? And that's where I say we have a power imbalance of like, it's just, working people they're under threat, and it just takes a lot of courage to stand up and do that. And I think it's much easier for a company to just spin a yarn about, a fictional bad egg or something. Well, this more than sets the table for our discussion. So very good. So if you want to call in, there's the number, 615-737-PLUS, 615-737-7587. We'll take a break. We'll come back. We'll talk about Tennessee specifically, the state of labor unions here in our state. Take a break. We'll be back right after this.